This is about a place that I lived for a short period in my 20s. It has been a long time, but I still tell this story to friends whenever people ask for a creepy story. I had moved out of my parents' house when I was 19, then did some traveling overseas for a few years. When I finally moved back to my hometown, I couldn't stomach the idea of living with my parents. I didn't have a job or much money, so I knew I would have to settle for something cheap. What I finally settled on was a tiny bachelor apartment on the top floor of a 3-story building. The rent was low, but the place was cramped. It had just enough space for a bed and a tiny table that doubled as my dining area. The building itself was probably built in the early 1900s, judging by the creaky floors and the odd angles in the walls. The kitchen had old appliances, and the bathroom was barely big enough to turn around in. Still, it was all I could afford at the time, and the location wasn't bad. The landlord, Dale, was an older man, probably in his late 60s. When I met him to see the place, he gave me a quick tour of the apartment, which didn't take long. It was literally a single room. The whole time that I was with him, he didn't say much. He seemed polite enough, just not the chatty type. Dale lived in the house too, but in a separate apartment in the basement. The ground floor had another apartment that was rented out to a family, and there was one more apartment on the top floor next to mine, but it was vacant. Dale mentioned that he hadn't had a tenant in that unit for a while. I found that odd, because the rent was really low. Even though it wasn't the best place, I thought someone would have taken it. The other unit on the top floor was a 2-bedroom, so with a roommate, it would have been really cheap. There was a shared foyer at the front of the house that led to a staircase. It went up to my apartment, and the empty one next to it. The basement and ground floor had their own private entrances, so I rarely crossed paths with anyone else in the house. After I moved in, I didn't hear much from the other tenants, and Dale never bothered me about anything. It seemed like a pretty good setup, and I was content living there. But after a few weeks, things started to get a little strange. One night at around midnight, I was still up watching TV. Eventually I wanted to get ready for bed, so I turned the TV off. That was when I heard footsteps on the stairs outside my apartment. The sound was soft, but in an old house like that, any movement echoed through the walls. The foyer outside my apartment wasn't locked, and I was worried that someone might have wandered in from the street. After a few minutes, I got up and walked over to the door. I looked through the peephole and could barely make out a shadow in the dim light of the staircase. I could see someone standing partway up the stairs. It took me a second, but eventually I realized that it was Dale. He wasn't doing anything as far as I could see, just standing there. He didn't knock on the door or say anything. Then he took a step up, and I could see more of him. He had a blank look on his face. He looked relaxed or bored, almost like he was waiting for a bus. I stood there for a few minutes watching, not really sure what to do. He wasn't breaking any rules or causing any trouble, but the whole thing felt off. I waited for a while, watching him through the peephole. Eventually, he turned and went back down the stairs. Over the next week, I noticed it happening again, always late at night. If I was awake at around midnight or a bit later, I would hear footsteps on the stairs, and sure enough, when I looked through the peephole, it was Dale standing there. He never knocked or anything. He just stood on the stairs for a few minutes, then walked away. It happened a few more times, and by the end of the week, I was starting to get genuinely uncomfortable. I debated whether or not I should say something to him, but it was really awkward since we didn't have a personal relationship. Eventually, I decided I'd ask him about it just to clear the air. One weekend, I ran into Dale outside while I was leaving for work. It seemed like a good time to bring it up, so I asked casually, "Hey Dale, have you been up in the hallway late at night? I've heard some things." He looked at me for a moment, and then said in a flat, emotionless voice, "I was just making sure everything was safe." His answer caught me off guard. It wasn't exactly an explanation, so I asked, "What do you mean by that?" Then he just turned and walked toward the basement, leaving me standing there. Up until then, I was thinking that he could be a sleepwalker. If that were the case, then I would have understood, but his answer was truly chilling. In the best case, maybe there was something going on in the neighborhood that I didn't know about. A crime problem possibly, but even then, what good would it do to stand in the stairs for 10 minutes, then walk away? After that conversation, I began looking for a new place. I didn't want to wait around to see if things got weirder. Dale wasn't mean or aggressive, but something about him felt off, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what his late-night safety checks were all about. I gave him notice, and was surprised when he didn't seem bothered by it. In fact, he was nice enough to refund my last month's rent and give back my deposit. He didn't ask any questions or try to convince me to stay. He was polite and seemed like a genuinely nice guy. Looking back, I don't know if he was just a lonely old man or if something was seriously wrong with him. All I know is that I'm glad I got out when I did. A couple years ago, I was kicked out of my apartment. It wasn't because of anything crazy. I had fallen behind on rent after my hours were cut. I'd been working at a company for a few years doing clerical work. They were doing a lot of cuts at the time, and some really good people were let go, so I was one of the lucky ones. Even still, it wasn't enough to survive, so I was looking for other work. I thought I could find another job quickly, but it didn't work out that way. By the time I realized I was in trouble, it was too late to catch up on rent. My landlord gave me a notice to vacate, and I didn't have much choice but to leave. I was scrambling to find a place, so I started looking online for something cheap. I didn't have a lot of savings, and the last thing I wanted was to end up on the street. Luckily, I found an ad for a room in a shared house. I figured it would be temporary, just something to hold me over until I could get back on my feet. I was 30 at the time, so I really didn't want roommates, but I couldn't afford anything on my own. The house wasn't anything special. It was an old 2-story townhouse with red brick on the outside. The front yard was a patchy mess of grass and exposed dirt that looked pretty crappy. The neighborhood was pretty run down too. Nothing dangerous, but not exactly a place people took pride in. I replied to the post and set up a viewing for the next day. That's when I met Tanner for the first time. He was a young guy in his mid-20s, and he acted like he owned the place, though I later found out he was just managing it for his parents. He had that smug, self-satisfied look about him, like he'd never had to worry about a thing in his life. He drove a shiny new BMW, which was out of place in the neighborhood. When he introduced himself, I could tell right away that he wasn't someone I'd get along with. He had this air of entitlement, like the rest of us were beneath him. When I first walked in, the smell hit me. It wasn't that bad, just a musty old kind of smell, like the place hadn't been cleaned in a long time. There were a few people already living there, all of them strangers to me. They seemed to keep to themselves though, which was fine with me. I wasn't looking to make friends, I just needed a place to crash. My room was small, just big enough for a bed and maybe a small desk. The window faced a brick wall, so there wasn't much natural light. Still, I thought I could make it work. I figured I wouldn't be spending a lot of time there anyway. I was trying to be optimistic and telling myself it was temporary. That being said, I didn't have many options, so I signed a 6-month lease anyway. After settling in, it didn't take long for me to notice the cockroach problem. They were everywhere, crawling out of the walls and showing up in the kitchen and bathroom. I tried to ignore it at first, figuring it wasn't worth the hassle to complain, but the longer I stayed, the worse it got. After a week or so, I brought it up to Tanner, but he just brushed me off, acting like I was making a big deal out of nothing. That only made me dislike him more, but I didn't have any other place to go, so I stuck it out for a while longer. A few more weeks passed, and the cockroach situation only got worse. They started showing up in my room, crawling across the floor, and even in my bed. I tried to keep things clean, and even got obsessive about cleanliness. The other roommates were pretty good too, and nobody ever left food out. There was an infestation in the whole building, and it really needed an exterminator. I think Tanner was simply too cheap to do it. I knew I couldn't stay there much longer, but I wanted to find a new place before breaking the lease. I kept mentioning the problem to Tanner every chance I got, but he always tried to tell me that it was nothing. I could tell he didn't care at all, and that really bugged me. One night, I'd had enough. I found a dead roach in my bed, and that was the last straw. I decided I couldn't stay in that house any longer. That night, I found another short-term place on Airbnb and decided to take the chance. The next day, I called Tanner and told him that I was breaking the lease. He didn't take it well. He started yelling at me over the phone, telling me that I'd still have to pay him. I didn't back down though. I told him the place was unlivable, but he just kept shouting. He hung up on me after a while, and I thought that would probably be the end of it. It would take a lot of effort for him to sue me, and it wouldn't have been worth a couple $1,000 anyway, even if he won. Later that day, I was at the house packing up. My new place wasn't going to be available until the following day, so I was still planning to stay the night. At around dusk, I looked out the window and saw Tanner's car pull up. I saw him stomp out and he slammed the door hard. I could tell he was still mad. He stormed into the house and slammed the front door too. I could hear it from all the way upstairs. I knew he was there for me because my roommates were all out, but I wasn't scared of that kid. I walked right down the stairs to confront him. We got into it for a while, and I was staying calm while he was screaming. Then out of nowhere, he pulled a gun out of his waistband. He pointed it at me and told me I wasn't going anywhere until I paid him every last cent. I put my hands up like it was some kind of robbery. Even though I was trying to stay calm, I felt a single tear run down my cheek. I didn't dare wipe it away though. After Tanner calmed down a bit, I told him I would keep paying just so I could get out of there. He lowered the gun and said that he'd kill me if I didn't pay. As soon as I got to my room, I finished packing up my things. I didn't want to stay in that house for another minute, but I waited until Tanner was gone. I left the house quietly after he had taken off and checked into a motel, then I called the cops. The police called me later that day and told me that Tanner was arrested. I was worried that he would deny it, but he was dumb enough to admit pulling the gun after I refused to pay. I still don't know why he would do that, but I think he might have felt so justified that the cops would side with him. He was dead wrong, and he ended up being charged for what he did. I stayed at an Airbnb for a few weeks, and that almost completely drained my finances, but eventually got another part-time job and found a new apartment. From what I heard, they let Tanner off with a slap on the wrist. He didn't even do any jail time for threatening me. He got off way too easy. A few years ago, I moved into a one-bedroom apartment in downtown Detroit. The building was small and basic. It was independently owned, not one of those big complexes with fancy amenities. It was only 3 stories high with 4 apartments on each floor. I liked that it wasn't a huge place, just something simple and manageable. When I first went to see the apartment, I met the landlord. He was a man in his 40s who was pretty quiet and reserved. He had dark hair that was starting to go gray, and he wore plain clothes. He didn't say much while he showed me around. He just pointed out the basics, like where the trash bins were and how the heating worked. He did mention that he lived in the building with his family. I didn't meet them, but they lived on the top floor, while the apartment that I was looking at was on the second. The apartment wasn't fancy, but it was clean and the rent was affordable, which was important to me. The place had hardwood floors that creaked a little when you walked on them, and the kitchen had solid wood cabinets like you'd find in a lot of older buildings. Nothing about it really stood out, but it was enough for what I needed at the time. The landlord handed me the lease to look over. It seemed like a lot of legal mumbo-jumbo, so I didn't read it. I just signed it right there on the spot. It was move-in ready, so he handed me the keys, and that was that. I didn't ask many questions because honestly, I didn't have many. It seemed like a quiet place in a big city, which was what I was looking for. I moved in the following weekend with just a few boxes and some basic furniture. I figured I could get the rest later if I needed anything. Not much happened for the first few days. I went to work, came home, and tried to settle into my new place. The neighborhood seemed a bit run down, but I wasn't too worried about it. I wasn't planning to stay out late or anything like that. The building was old, and the walls were thin, so I could hear the occasional noise from my neighbors, but nothing too bothersome. After I had settled in, I started to notice that the neighborhood was even rougher than I initially thought. I would hear sirens more often than I was used to, and sometimes I'd see sketchy-looking people around. I tried to shrug it off, though. Every big city had its rough spots, so I just needed to mind my own business. One night, 2 weeks after I moved in, something happened that made me rethink everything. It was a Friday night, and I had stayed up a bit later than usual watching TV. At around midnight, I heard a knock on my door. I muted the TV and stayed still for a moment. My first instinct was to ignore it, but then I got curious. I slowly walked over to the door and looked through the peephole. Standing right in front of my door was a young guy, maybe around 18 or 19. He had a hood pulled over his head, but I could see his face clearly enough. He was just staring straight at my door, not saying anything. Behind him, I could see 2 other guys standing a little further back in the hallway, also looking at my door. They weren't doing anything, just standing there. I obviously didn't open it and didn't say anything. After what felt like a long time, they finally turned and walked down the hallway. I waited a few more seconds to make sure they were gone before I moved away from the door. I made sure it was locked, and then I slid the chain lock into place, even though it felt pretty weak. I went to bed soon after and fell asleep, but sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of my door crashing open. I didn't jump up right away like I should have. Instead, I lay still. Then I heard the sound of someone moving around in my apartment. I didn't have a weapon or anything to defend myself, so I did the only thing I could think of. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and hid in the closet. I could hear at least a few people out in the living room, and they were ransacking my apartment. I felt completely helpless because I had left my phone charging in the kitchen. I couldn't even call the cops. All I could do was wait and hope they wouldn't find me. Eventually, I heard someone come into my room, but I didn't dare try to peek. The whole time, I didn't hear a single word spoken by any of them. I didn't know what they took from my room, but I was hoping that they didn't find any of my important stuff. Eventually, I heard them leave, but I stayed in the closet for a while longer, just to be sure they were really gone. When I went out, the place was a mess, and a few things were missing, including my laptop and phone. With no other way to call for help, I knocked on my neighbor's door. She was a nice older woman, and she answered right away, even though it was late. The commotion probably woke her up too. She called the police, then I went home to wait. The intruders were long gone by the time the cops showed up, and the police didn't seem to take it that seriously. They told me it was probably just a random break-in, maybe someone who saw me moving in and figured I was an easy target. I got the idea that break-ins like that were common, so that's probably why the cops didn't care. I went on to tell them about the 3 guys that I saw earlier, and one of the cops said that it was probably them. Apparently they'll test doors by knocking, in order to choose targets where nobody is home. I guess I should have done something to show I was there. The next morning, I went to talk to my landlord upstairs. I wanted to let him know what happened, and see if he had cameras or something, even though I didn't see any. I went up to his apartment and knocked on his door. It was early in the morning by then, but after a few moments, he answered. As soon as the door opened, I noticed his son in the background. He was sitting on the couch, looking at his phone, but as soon as he saw me, he glanced up. Our eyes met, and I instantly recognized him. It was definitely the same kid who had been at my door before I was robbed. I couldn't prove anything, but I had a strong feeling that he was one of the guys that broke in. I didn't say a word about it to the landlord, though. I just told him about the break-in and asked if there was anything he could do to help. He said he'd get my door fixed, but didn't offer much else. I moved out about 2 months after, because I never felt safe there again. I'm almost sure that my landlord's son robbed me, and I think he may have even known. I don't know what kind of messed up building they were running, but it was sketchy as hell. After my divorce last year, I moved to a new town with no job and no place to live. I was in a bit of a tough spot, and after a month of staying in an Airbnb that I couldn't really afford, I knew I needed something more permanent. One day when I was searching online, I came across an ad for a room for rent in the basement of a house. It was reasonably priced, but I didn't really want to live in a basement. However, since I had been looking around with no luck for weeks, I decided to check it out. The house was in an average neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but not bad either. When I went to see the place, I was met by the owner, a guy in his 20s named Lance. He was laid back and seemed like a bit of a stoner. No judgment on my part, just an observation. It did strike me as odd that someone his age could afford a house, especially in this area where real estate wasn't cheap. But I didn't ask too many questions. I was more focused on getting a place to stay. The basement room was small, but it was furnished, and I had my own entrance. We would share the kitchen and bathroom upstairs, which I figured wouldn't be a big deal. Lance's living room was set up with a massive gaming rig, which made me think he might be a streamer or something. If that was the case, then it would explain why he had money. He didn't talk much about what he did though, and I didn't pry. I paid him the first and last month's rent up front, and just like that, I had a place to live. Moving in was a relief. I didn't have a lot of stuff, so it was an easy transition. The basement was quiet, and I was just glad to have a roof over my head. I figured I could take my time looking for work, now that I had a stable and affordable place to stay. After living there for a while, I started to notice that Lance was pretty reclusive. I didn't see much of him, but I definitely heard him. His gaming setup was no joke, and he'd be up all night playing. He used a headset, but he would yell most of the time while playing. That wasn't the only noise, though. It seemed like he always had people over. I could hear them coming and going at all hours, and the noise from upstairs was almost constant. There were nights when I'd hear laughter and loud conversations late into the night. One night, though, things took a turn. I was woken up in the middle of the night by the sound of the back door slamming. It was loud, and the footsteps that followed were heavy, almost aggressive. I was curious, so I got out of bed and quietly made my way to the bottom of the stairs. I could hear voices, but they weren't very loud. I sat there listening for a while, and eventually, I caught enough to realize what they were talking about. It sounded like a drug deal was going down, and from what little I could hear, it wasn't just weed. They were talking about harder stuff. It hit me then that I had no idea what kind of situation I had gotten myself into. I crept back to my room, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew I didn't want to be living in a place where this kind of stuff was going on. The next morning, I was exhausted and anxious, but I knew I needed to make a decision. I went up to talk to Lance, figuring I'd just be upfront about wanting to leave. I was just going to ask for my money back and go. When I found him in the living room, he was sitting at his computer with his headset on. I said hey to get his attention, and when he looked up, he took the headphones off. I told him straight up that I needed to move out, and I wanted my money back. At first, Lance tried to talk me out of it. He asked if there was something wrong with the room or anything. I told him it wasn't about the room, but I didn't go into detail about what I had overheard the night before. I didn't want to get into it with him. I just wanted to get my money and go. He kept pressing me though, and eventually I told him that I knew what was going on in the house. His whole demeanor changed in an instant. He went from being calm and laid back to angry. I stood my ground though and didn't lose my cool. I told him I wasn't going to call the cops or anything like that. I just wanted my money back so I could leave. That seemed to calm him down a bit, but he was still pretty angry. He glared at me for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash. He counted out the money and threw it at the ground near my feet. Then he walked away and told me to get the F out of his house. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed the cash off of the floor and went straight back to my room to pack up my stuff. I booked an Airbnb for that night and made sure I was out of the house before it got dark. I was glad to be out of there, but I was pissed at myself for not realizing sooner what kind of place I had moved into. It was a hard lesson learned, but at least I got out before things could get any worse.